So this chapter deals with the foremost preoccupation in international relations, and that is political violence. In the 20th century, the majority of scholarship really was interested in how to prevent war and what the different war technologies changed about war. And in the 21st century, we're a lot more concerned about terrorism. But political conflict and military conflict is really the heart of international relations. And the first bullet point here really references a disaster film from the 1980s that is really mentioned more because of the fact that Ronald Reagan included a reference to this film in one of his famous speeches about nuclear fear. And The Day After is honestly a joke compared to the plethora of disaster movies that have come out since then, but it really just sort of captured the nation's concern during the Cold War related to the nuclear conflict with Russia. And today we really replace this more with fears of terrorism. And this has led some scholars to ask if major war has ended, really, especially in the way that we think of World War II and World War I. But other scholars say that war is kind of a continuous phenomenon and we're just on sort of a break. And what's involved in these larger scale wars really is a lot of technological innovation and a large number of deaths. And this is really only the norm after states become the dominant form of society. And we've experienced 2 world wars where states not only in Europe but also in the Pacific region were fighting against one another, and this led to over 100 million casualties. But modern warfare has changed, and it occurs less frequently as time has progressed. If you want a more full history of this, you can see pages 400 through 403. And one thing is for sure that in spite of a very strong pacifist movement that results from World War I, which was up until that point the bloodiest war in history, we still have an impulse in some countries to create war. So during World War I and World War II, the new forms of technology that characterized warfare included some of these innovations up to nuclear weapons. And another distinguishing feature is the fact that these are advanced economies that shift all of their productive capacity to creating war machines. So when we talk about industrial scale war, we're talking about the prioritization of war machines in the economy and most economic growth really stemming from war endeavors. So the Cold War era that begins shortly after the end of World War II and extends up until the early 1990s is the standoff between the United States and the USSR. It is a dual competition. It's ideological over whether or not communism or capitalism will triumph, but it is also about which one of these powers can build up the most nuclear weapons. Prior to this bipolar era, the power in the world system was really distributed among several powerful states, and this changed dramatically after World War II. Part of that has to do with the defeat of the Asian empire of Japan that you saw with the nuclear weapon dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. After World War II, the bipolar war is aided by international agreements. The Warsaw Pact saw Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany as the domain of Russia's influence, and NATO was the allied countries in Europe with the United States, and they took over West Germany. At the same time, these two forces began to build up massive amounts of nuclear weapons that amounted to 8,000 times the explosives that were used in World War II. During this time, a lot of theories do kind of proliferate around the issue of nuclear war and the possible threat of it. But mutually assured destruction is one of those that stands out the most, and it explains why no major outbreak of war occurs during this time. It is because both of these major players are assured destruction if they attack one another due to things like second strike capability. Also, the fact that even if you aren't retaliated against, if you launch a nuclear weapon, the possibility of nuclear winter affects even countries that don't launch weapons. So it's basically been something that doesn't happen for that reason. But we do see war in this time. You see the growth of guerrilla warfare in places like Latin America and Africa, but also proxy wars that are fought basically over the leadership of these countries: Greece, Nicaragua, Cuba, places like Afghanistan and Iran in the Middle East in the 1980s. And the leadership of these countries is being courted essentially during these wars by both the United States and the USSR, and this leads to quite a bit of bloodshed. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it becomes even more of a pattern that smaller wars between smaller powers are the norm, and also the entry of less formal organizations, non-state actors, in other words, involved in conflict. And the New World really is characterized by one major world power, and that is the United States. And the question becomes, are there any challengers? And so here is some of the data about GDP, population, military spending that really kind of give us a clue as to who those potential challengers would be for the world power. In the contemporary period, conflict between countries or conflict between armed rebels and country governments has really been related to lower intensity violence and lower battlefield deaths. And again, the smaller powers, or what we would call middle level powers, are the ones that are now engaged in military conflicts with one another. But while this is a positive, we've also seen a rise in humanitarian crises between these middle powers related to ethnic cleansing and genocide, and also the advent of WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. You see chemical weapons being used against populations by the Iraqi government. And so these are big concerns when we think about theorizing about who is important in the interstate world, who is the cause of conflict. And we used to think that was states, but we are seeing more and more evidence that non-state actors, terrorist organizations, even multinational corporations, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, have a big role in how international relations plays out. This graphic displays the number of conflicts per year. As we move through time, you actually see quite a bit of decreasing of colonial power wars, fewer interstate wars, and a big jump in civil wars. In other words, wars between societies within states. Here we have the Balkan region and the Baltic region, which are characterized by civil war, and their new maps have been shaped by civil war. At least since 9/11/2001, we have been concerned in the field of international relations with what we call new security issues. And that forces us to recognize that it is not the the only threats are not situated within states who might militarily attack us. We might face threats from terrorists, from non-state actors who use very specific tactics that are out of the war context. And this does make it difficult for governments to kind of predict them, to respond to them. But it's become really an area of preoccupation since attacks in some of these major cities around the world, in Nigeria and in the Middle East. We tend to associate Islamism with terrorism, but it is important to note that there are other types of terrorist acts, especially within the United States. I would definitely take that outside of the United States as well. But we have historical terrorist attacks that are not related to Islam at all. So when we talk about terrorism, the definition is really important, and we're referring to politically motivated violence that aims to terrorize an opponent rather than defeat them militarily. And the invention of terrorism precedes our obsession with Islamism, right? It goes back to the anarchy movement in the 1870s, where the goal was to eliminate the government. And assassinations of political leaders was one of the tactics that was used. We're talking about the anarchy movement in the Western Europe. And terrorism also began to morph after this to include non-military targets, civilian targets. And these were often tactics used by anti-colonial movements, and included hijacking, kidnapping, bombings, political assassinations, and again became more extreme by targeting innocents. And this is in contrast to the early terrorist movements that targeted political leaders. And again, because data is good to have, here are some of the most memorable and most bloody terrorist attacks in history. And when it comes to the death toll of terrorist attacks, 8 of the 10 worst attacks were not related to Islam at all from our previous table. Sunni extremists do claim the deadliest attack, the greatest number of deaths occurred in 9/11 out of all of these terrorist attacks. This is related to the attempt to purify Muslim societies that starts their movement really in the early 20th century. If you remember when we talked about ideologies, Islamism is a form of fascism, and this begins to take off really alongside some of the other forms of fascism. And the key connections to terror start back in 1979 with the local Mujahideen reaction against Soviet invasion. This is one of those proxy wars where there was an attempt to stop the United States from having influence and to push communist influence. But even going even further and through history, 1983, 1993, 96, 2000, so that we begin to characterize this age as the age of terror. We most often associate the Taliban as kind of the root, but it goes back. It includes more than just the Taliban, who are these Pashtun tribes in the neighboring regions of Pakistan. And domestically, this has had a pretty big impact on our criminal justice system, our civil liberties. There were a lot of special provisions provided to the government through the U.S. Patriot Act that allows them to issue private subpoenas and allows them to surveil civilians without necessarily being letting them know. This also leads to the creation of the special terrorist prison, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And these are highly controversial. They continue to shape political responses domestically as well as internationally. So this basically sums up the major conflict issues that we see in international relations.